I started working at the site in 1984, but actually came to Jerash in 1982 to work at the North Theatre. My job was being for the Hippodrome the chief archaeologist, actually the only one, so I can call myself a chief archaeologist. And it was really not so much the fieldwork excavation, which was done by Anthony, but to study the context and the contents, and especially the ceramics and other artifactual finds from the excavations. Anthony was my husband, Kehrberg-Ostrasz, who was the architect and director of the Hippodrome restoration project. So he ran the entire project, including the excavations of the ruins. I'm from Australia, originally from Sydney, but have been visiting Jordan for quite a number of years.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time you came to Jerash?
To Jerash, in fact, not to work, but to visit when I was on an excavation at the Dead Sea in 1975, when I still saw Bedouin and camels and donkeys roaming the site before it was shut off for tourism. When the international teams came, and I was part of the Australian team, we started in the middle of 1982.
Wow.
And Anthony, who was the architect of the Polish team, came about the same time.
What was that first project?
It's called the Jerash International Project, which was funded by the World Bank to help Jordan to enhance tourism. And the money was paid, as I said, by the World Bank to Jerash and Petra in particular, being the main tourism sites apart from the Dead Sea and so on. And in fact, money was also promised by Saddam Hussein, but because he started fighting Iran, the money was never forthcoming, which meant that the first part of the project, the archaeological project, ceased by the end of 1983. What actually happened was that I had worked first in prehistoric sites in Jordan and in Cyprus, but I've also studied classical archaeology, and each nation that was invited to participate in this international project, there were countries who had worked in Jerash before, in Jordan, and the heads or directors of these projects were invited to make up national teams. And so I was asked by my professor, who was heading the previous excavations at the Dead Sea, he included me to be part of the Jerash project. But I had previously worked more on prehistoric sites than on classical sites, although I have studied classical material. Well, when you come to Jerash, when I visited it in 1975, you can't but say that it's a charming place, and it's enchanting. Even today, with its modernization, it still has that wonderful sense of ruins being alive without restoration, telling you a story, plus the local population still living on the site. I was just really struck by its beauty, because it still had local people living on what is now the Park of Antiquity, or the ancient site. They were only removed before the late 70s, early 80s, like at Petra, to make room for tourism. Well, I used to come until 1912 every year. Not 1912, sorry, 2012, that's a century. But then, because of political circumstances around this area, projects were not being funded, which didn't enable me to come and visit as frequently. So it's been 7 years since I've been back. From end of 1982 to end of 2003.
You were living here?
Well, I was living permanently until 2001, and then I lived in England half the year and half the year in Jordan. To describe it most properly is, my son always said, your email address should be Ina Gypsy Archaeologist, because this is what we all did. We lived on the camp. Our life was really our work, but that didn't mean we didn't enjoy life outside our work as well. But it was really, I think you could almost compare it to being a doctor. It's a 24-hour occupation, but not in the physical sense. And it was easy to live on the camp because we had other teams. We made a really good group of international teams, where I met Massimo, and because it was international, and let me put it that way, it was like the United Nations. Every site has its own national identity. So the Hippodrome became Polish-Australian, the Zeus Temple was French, the Artemis Temple was Italian, the McKellum was Spanish, the Umayyad house before that was Polish, the cathedral became Swiss, etc., etc. So it became a small United Nations, and we were always encouraged to work together. And we compared notes. We were not competitive in the sense of, you know, we shared information and that. Not really, because I dug at Saqqara in Egypt, which was a British dig, and there were no other teams working. I worked in Cyprus, and the same thing happened there. And Jerash is the only place that I can remember, even from visiting other sites, that had that, apart from Petra, because it was also the same sort of scenario, that had that international complex, and probably Palmyra again, where you had many national different teams working at the same time. But it was something you can imagine, almost also like being an artist. You could engage 100% in it. You were not hampered by bureaucracy, by paperwork, by administration. You had a 9-to-5 job digging wise, because we had the team, the work team, and we started work at 7 in the morning and it finished at 2:30 in the afternoon. And then our other work would start, looking at the finds, processing the daily stuff which you had to do in order to proceed the next day. So it was that kind of work, you know. Initially when we came, it wasn't that foreigners were resented, but there was a certain anxiety about the project, because it was considered that there may be a negative influence of the society. Remember, Jerash is a country town, it was very traditional. I can't talk about today, but at the time when we started in 82, 83, it was very much so. For instance, all the national teams or international teams lived in modern Jerash. We had houses assigned to us, and it was because of a certain amount of conflict, like the teams were boys and girls, that was not quite accepted, without being too nasty or anything, but it was just not fitting the norm of the town. So the Department of Antiquities decided to build the camp on site so that we could actually live our life and undisturbed, and actually even were able to, for instance, consume alcohol within the camp. You couldn't buy alcohol, for instance, at Jerash at the time. You were served alcohol in teapots in the tourism site outside Jerash, which was kind of understood. But talking in serious terms, the integration happened. We were very much, after a while, accepted. And because it was outside the city wall, it was not considered to be part of the city itself. For instance, which Anthony did very cleverly and very sensitively, there was a water canal channel sort of going right across the arena, feeding the fields, which you can't see anymore. There were fields. And not to aggravate the local population, he restored the water channel but covered it so that they got cleaner water, and we could restore the arena at the same time. So that was how he worked, very sensitively, to work with the people to make to disturb them as little as possible. We weren't decided, because that was the project. The archaeological project became a restoration project, and the whole tenet of it was the foreign architects were re-employed to restore, ideally from the local point of view, to rebuild. And it was us, we were employed by UNESCO to adhere very closely, totally, to the Venice Charter of Restoration, which means you could not restore more than if there was 80% of the remains of the building. You could not rebuild or reconstruct what you could do on paper. The theoretical restoration had to remain that. So you could not do a virtual restoration on the ground. And that was why we were here and employed in the first place. So the Department of Antiquity had accepted that tenet as the principle of our employment, and for them to get the money in the first place to do that.
It was the best path?
I think it is the only way to do, because in the 60s, before the Venice Charter was built, it was universal. Restoration was much more of rebuilding. And in some ways, we've replaced that with Hollywood movies like The Gladiator and all such, where you now can, on the screen, build the virtual building without having to do it on the ground. But the restorations are supposed to explain the building. It is to really make people see what it was, but not to put in theories and supplement something that wasn't there. You had to, it is a study of the building, and you can only go as far as the material allows you to. So for Anthony, for instance, I explained that to Massimo. He was often asked, why do you just put one part of restoration and then you part of the other one, and this one was a bit and that one was a bit restored? And Anthony said, who was a very experienced restorer, an architect, he said, I want to put into place which part I could restore properly. So one day when I'm gone and people want to continue to restore, that they have to follow my lead. Unfortunately, it didn't quite happen that way, that his lead wasn't quite followed, but he did set a stamp, he did set a standard, and it wasn't completely wasted, if you know what I mean. It just set a certain limit of what could be done. And one also has to remember, it is partly the Western aspect. Giving money for restoration to attract tourism is also our obligation, because we are asking the local community in the country to actually rebuild to attract tourists. So we can't ask to restore and then put restrictions on their own heritage, how they want to represent it. And a lot of the tourists, they're not just from one part of the world. They might want to see something that is more restored or more rebuilt, and the local the government, the authority might want to respond to all of that. You see, so it's not a very straightforward scenario. There are a lot of things, but all you can do is, as the individual employed, for the reason that you are, that you follow your professional integrity. I agree that, and I was actually asked by UNESCO, we had an interview when UNESCO visited in 2006 or something, and very much talked about the local community and involvement. I must admit that it actually wasn't us so much as the Department of Antiquities who prevented us from doing the engaging work. For instance, we wanted the museum built, some of us, and quite a number, in modern Jerash, so that the tourists...
Can you tell this story, please?
It is modern Jerash, which has still got where the bars are, where the bridges are, in that part of the souk area. And we thought if we could have the museum there, past the bridge that was rebuilt, that would encourage tourists to go into modern Jerash and also visit the Ottoman Jerash. And it would also encourage the people of Jerash to see tourism in a beneficial sort of way, rather than being excluded. I also was very much involved also with Iman to engage through the Friends of Archaeology, which was part of my job at the time. I mean, not job, but obligation, to involve schools and teachers and so on. And we were told, and it was very hard, we had to teach the teachers about the antiquity of the site and how to make use of it before we could teach the children. And they were not allowed, to some degree, to talk about the antiquity of the site and include it in their teaching. So we had to make it into a playground. For instance, we had meetings where I would bring Jerash lamps and the molds, and I buy modern clay, and I let the children make ancient lamps. And then I said, now you take it to the museum and see which lamp you've made to engage. And that was so successful that all the parents came and wanted to make lamps. And and actually, and we thought that would be the best way. And it started a little bit that way, but it was very much not the Department of Antiquities. It was really us with some members of the Department of Antiquities, but the members of the foreign institutions, to do slowly to integrate. But the resistance was very strong within Jerash not to build more. For instance, it included not to have a hotel built here because of the danger of corrupting the community. So this is all part of it. So it's the preparation of the department in Amman wasn't thorough enough to integrate the local department to bring in certain help to assist. But for instance, Anthony had students of architecture working with us. Yeah, to train. I actually taught the workers about pottery because I thought they should know why they were excavating, and they enjoyed that. And I did the same when I worked with the French at this temple. So I tried on that level to get them more involved, and that was certainly made their work more interesting, you know, and that kind of thing. But we could never really draw in people. I tried to, because I said, you know, look at the destruction of the Ottoman buildings and all that, but we were told to basically stay away. And when I tried to take photos, obviously people didn't like me to do that, and that didn't mean I was actually accepted as part of the community. I was Mark, and there was Anthony was Abu Mark, and we were very much part of it. And when, I must say, for instance, when Anthony died, it was a very fast, quick, sudden death. The mosque in Amman announced his death as being part of a Jerashi member. The mayor hosted the whole, if you want, celebration at the restaurant and invited the whole village and all the workers to celebrate him. He was very much loved and honored, and it showed that we were part of the city, of the town. And I think it would have happened to everybody, but the fact when I walked and I heard Anthony's name at the mosque, calling out, saying that he died, and he was considered a member. And like today, immediately when the inspector asked after our son, you know, that kind of thing. And I remember Abu Koko, who the Poles called him Abu Koko, Samir. When Anthony died, he said, Ina, if you need money, please come to me. That's a shopkeeper. It shows you the way we were accepted and integrated. But that didn't mean they necessarily approved of what we did work-wise. There were two different things altogether. We had no trouble digging the city wall in the modern city, but that was a very small trench. And that was also behind the police station. So I think it was a bit expedient to have both. But I've never felt uncomfortable. I always felt part of the Jerash community, but I also knew that didn't necessarily agree with what we did. For instance, Anthony wanted the hippodrome to become part of, to protect the hippodrome to be used in for other purposes. He talked to the mayor and the Department of Antiquities whether we could make the hippodrome the football field for the football club. He thought that was an ideal solution to protect the site for itself, because after all it's an arena and it could be football, but that was not accepted by the Department of Antiquities, which was a shame. And he said we could make wooden stalls. He had designed that already on that side, so we could have spectators and it could be done. But they didn't like the idea. Well, actually I would start again from scratch. I would start initiative again, because I assume that people have changed. The population has shifted a little bit, and wallahi, as they say, there is the money aspect, and if they could see financial benefit, I think it could become part. But you don't do it, you do it with one side first to demonstrate. Then you might open the market where the bars are across the bridge, to open that and gradually draw in so that the tourists don't swamp too much and just see where the benefits are. I think that can happen today, because what we have created is an archaeological park, which is separate from, like at Petra, separate from the people. And we could integrate it by allowing uses of it other than just the Jerash festival, for instance. because the Jerash Festival gives one. But again, the Jerash Festival is often resented by the local population as a foreign infiltration. The Jerash Festival is resented, or was when I was still living here, as a foreign intervention and was superimposed. The local community was not asked to participate, they were just superimposed. But you see, the other thing might have to do, it might also have changed. I thought that, for instance, the revenue of tourism, I talked to then the Director General, doesn't matter who it was, because I said, why don't we, and I was prepared to organize it, collect pottery sherds and makeup bags with representing different period pottery sherds, label them Department of Antiquities, and the tourists can buy them on one bag, a dinar a bag, rather than collecting it, because we can use it from our dump sites. And that way, Jerash would get more money. And I was told, no, don't bother, because the money will not go back to Jerash. They were not interested, because the money wouldn't go back to Jerash. Anthony had recommended donkeys and horses to visit the site. There was no interest, because the revenue would not go back to the Department of Antiquities here. I must say that was 20 years ago, so things might have changed now.
In the department too? Or in the Department of Antiquities?
Well, I don't know, because we proposed it to the Department of Antiquities. You might hope it would, because there was a lot of initiatives that didn't cost any money, and I would have gladly done it. It would have been even fun, like our teaching with the Friends of Archaeology. But I was really surprised to find that the revenue from tourism from Jerash does not go back to Jerash, you see. And I think if it did, the local population would be much more interested. The Jerash Hippodrome is the best restored, not restoration-wise, but has the best remains to understand the function and the structure of the Hippodrome. It has the most extant remains, partly because of our thorough excavations, which was only enabled because we worked full-time for 12 years. But most of the other hippodromes have been destroyed to a large extent, including the Maximus in Rome. And he published that. It was the Jerash Hippodrome which could explain the functions of racing to a detailed point, which makes this the smallest but best preserved hippodrome of the known Roman hippodromes of the world. So that is already very special. But for instance, the mechanism of the gates, of how the chariots were brought into the gates. They were not brought across the arena, but there are ramps built behind the gates, which the charioteers led the horses in to the stalls. Anthony went as far as going to the royal stables of measuring the rumps of the horses to know whether we could have quadriga or the two-horse. And it fitted four-horse chariots because of the type of horses that were used at the time. So that kind of scientific work, that goes way beyond the architectural work. But it is the remains that allowed him to reconstruct what was known often only by illustrations on mosaics and wall paintings, etc. And that is really very unique. It is the best preserved, as he said, the smallest but best preserved of the known hippodromes. There may be some others still underground that might be discovered. Because it was part of a bigger city town built over, like you also have in Rome, and then there are not that many hippodromes. And remember, the hippodrome was not a weekend racing. The hippodrome used in festivals. And did you know, for instance, that at the hippodromes, which I love as a story in itself, in theatres, you have special gates where men and women sat separately in Roman times and Hellenistic times. The hippodrome was the only place where boys and girls, men and women, could sit together, and they would bet in their races. And you can see why it became very popular, not only because of racing and money, but because couples and to-be couples could actually meet and sit together at the hippodrome. How good is that?
Shocking.
Yeah, but it was at the hippodrome that it was possible. My favorite part is the view of the Carceres and beyond. when you stand there, you see the world. It is just magnificent. And that is what people would have seen coming from Amman along the Roman Via Trajana, Hadrianic Arch and the arches and the Hippodrome. What an entry to a city, to a town. Magnificent. I think everything for me is unique. The dwelling, the pottery workshops, everything. But this visual aspect, and I've been here many times, I've taken many photos of the sunsets and, you know, all of that. This is just magnificent, yes.